It's a good day for spreading democracy, isn't it? Welcome back. My name is Crook, and today I'm going to be going over individual builds and team compositions more from an overall philosophy standpoint. I will give a few tips on individual builds, but I really want to put across how your build should fit into the overall team composition because team composition is far more important than the individual build itself. Now, as you can see in this footage, I'm running a recoilless rifle, my teammates got an autocannon, and our third opts not to bring a stratagem-based weapon. And as far as my primary and secondary, I end up running with a Dominator and a Dagger laser pistol because the greater purpose of this build that I wanted to run here was sort of an experiment to see if I had the correct idea for how each of these weapons should be used because I've seen so many comments on YouTube and in social media and Reddit and talking about, the Dominator being great but not having enough ammo and the Dagger being like totally useless. And my assertion was that people weren't using them right. And I think in this footage you'll see that I make a good case for people not understanding how to use these weapons. I do think part of it is that people have an impression on what primary and secondary weapon means from other games like, Battlefield, Call of Duty, things like that. But this game is different. And to illustrate that point, you're going to see in this footage my idea for this build is that when I see regular trash, your what I call light infantry, things like the Ravager infantry on the bot side or the scavengers and hunters on the bug side, the smaller stuff, that's what you use the pistol for. You use the pistol to clear those things out because they don't have a lot of health. You don't need to use a lot to take them out. And the Dagger pistol has a really good range and a really good damage. So it is the primary thing that you should be using to take out trash. Whereas the Dominator, being a very high damage weapon but having a very low ammo capacity, is something you should be using more on what I call heavy infantry. Things like the Devastators, the Berserkers, or on the bug side, the Hive Guardians or the Brood Commanders. That's what you should be using a Dominator for, or a Plasma Scorcher, things like that. You get the idea. Now, there was a drawback to this build that I want to get out of the way because it is important to know that while the Dominator is very, very good against Devastators, it is a one-shot headshot on Devastators if you can get the headshot. It does suffer when it comes to the walkers. The round, despite being a medium armor penetrating weapon, it doesn't have the punch to get through and take out a walker. The rounds will deflect right off the walker, as you're going to see here shortly. But again, against Devastators, it's a very good weapon. Now, you can already see my strategy for this. I'm not using the Dominator yet. I'm using the pistol. And this is what I was talking about earlier, though. You're going to see these Dominator rounds just deflect right off of the walker. But I get a little bit lucky here in that we get a drop full of Devastators, and it gives me an opportunity to shine with this Dominator and just start dropping these guys very, very quickly. Now, unfortunately, my other test that I wanted for this build was to see how the recoilless rifle performed when it came to bots. And as you can see, we're only on level 5, so we didn't exactly run across a lot of tanks and stuff like that. I don't even think we saw any Hulks on this one. But it didn't really perform well enough for me to really even recommend bringing it for automaton missions. There's really anything I could have potentially taken out with the recoilless rifle, I could also have taken out with something like a grenade launcher or even the standard machine gun everyone gets at level 1. And while you can use the recoilless to do things like take out dropships, which you'll see me do a bit later, the reality is while it does work now, and that is really nice, there's still a fundamental problem in that if you take out a dropship with the recoilless rifle, the crew still survives, which sort of makes the idea of taking out a dropship with the recoilless completely useless. Like, it's neat and it feels good to do, but when all the bots that the dropship was bringing in just walk out of the wreckage completely unharmed, it kind of negates the purpose of even shooting at the dropships at all in the first place. So, if they fix that, then that will change everything. The recoilless will be a great way to prevent a flare from even being a problem at all because you can just shoot the dropships down. But again, with the crew surviving the dropship destruction right now, it really doesn't matter if you shoot a dropship with one or not, which means that as far as automatons are concerned, there's really not a use for the recoilless rifle, which is unfortunate. Whereas, as you can see, my teammate having the autocannon, especially when it came to taking out that fabricator you saw a second ago, that's very useful. And again, if you get a good angle on those vents with the autocannon, you can take them out from across the map if you really want to. So, as far as individual choice, right now, as it stands, I can't recommend the recoilless rifle for automatons. Now, that's not the case with the bugs. I, especially if you're playing on a mission above level 5 at 5 or above, I would say at least one person should be running the recoilless rifle on all missions because the reality is it is the best weapon to take out chargers. It's a one-shot headshot on chargers. And now I know people are going to say, but it is with the EAT too. And while, yeah, that is the case, you get 2 EATs and then you have to wait for a cooldown. So that's 2 chargers you can take out before you have to start using stratagems like the laser, the rail cannon strike, and things like that. Whereas with the recoilless rifle, you've got 6 total shots. There's 1 already in the chamber, and then you've got 5 rockets on the back that you can use to take out chargers. So that's ideally, assuming you're getting headshots on every charger, that's 6 chargers you can take out before you even need to resupply. On higher difficulties, that is a big, big, big deal. And if you've got somebody running a supply pack, the way, in my opinion, you should, then that person can keep equipping you with rockets and keep that going over and over and over again. Because one thing to think about, while a lot of people do, I think smartly use the supply pack and say something like the grenade launcher or the machine gun to keep themselves supplied so that they're not eating into their teammates' supplies, it's also important to notice that the supply pack does essentially function as a second resupply beacon that someone can call down, or even a third if you've got 3 people running the supply pack. It can really be a force multiplier in that aspect, because if you've got someone like me running a recoilless against bugs, when I run out against chargers, the person with the supply pack can come right in, equip me. I think each supply you grant with the recoilless is, I think, 2 of the actual shells. So you can very quickly resupply somebody, and then they have a whole 6 other chargers they can take out. So when you're playing on high difficulties with bugs especially, the recoilless really can't be beat when it comes to dealing with chargers. So if you've got, in my opinion, a recoilless rifle, I think as a bare minimum you should have 1. I also think as a bare minimum you should have 1 other person running a grenade launcher and a supply pack, because the grenade launcher is very, very good against bile spewers and nursing spewers, things like that. So I think those 2 are sort of, in my opinion, bare minimum staple weapons for bugs. Now, when it comes to bots, while I still think the grenade launcher is sort of a staple weapon that at least 1 person should bring for the exact same reason, it's just so versatile. It handles so many different things so well. I think The other options are a bit more open. Because of the effectiveness of the recoilless against chargers, it's, in my opinion, the weapon, but it's not the same case with bots. There's a lot more leeway in what you can bring on the bot side and still be useful, particularly because even with something like a tank, even if you need to take out a tank, if you can hit the weak spot, a lot of these stratagem weapons can take out a tank, from the autocannon to the railgun to even even things like the basic machine gun. If you get a weak spot hit with the basic machine gun, you can take out a tank. It has the armor penetration to do it, but not everything is going to. The stalwart doesn't quite do enough armor damage to get through because the automaton weak points on things like tanks are a little different. Because if you see the metal grate over the weak spot like you do on the tanks or the big tower turrets, that means you need a weapon with a bit more armor pen. Now, to help illustrate this, I've made this chart here, and this isn't perfect. It's not really based on a solid set of numbers since we don't really have a whole lot of number data to go by with this. So this is more of a guideline than a solid database chart. But it's mostly just to give you an idea of how you should think about the roles of these weapons. And as you can see, when you start to look at this, you start to see how these weapons lay out in terms of how much area damage they do versus how much individual target damage they do. With, the obvious flamethrower on the left being the end of one extreme and the railgun being the obvious extreme in the opposite direction. And you see there is wiggle room between each one of these, and you can see how they transition from one to the other. Because, for example, the recoilless rifle and the EAT are very similar, and there is sort of a mostly semantic difference between the two. The EATs are great. The recoilless rifle is also great. But as we discussed before, which one you want to use depends highly on who you're fighting and what mission you're on and what difficulty you're on. Because if you're at a low difficulty, EATs can do just fine. If you're at a high difficulty where you have, let's say, a bug mission with a lot of chargers and a lot of bile titans, the EAT's going to start to fail you because there just simply aren't enough. You aren't able to put enough rounds downrange fast enough to take out all those targets, and you'll start having to rely more and more on your other stratagems, which, because of the cooldowns those have, aren't going to necessarily be as reliable as having a weapon like this. And it's why, as my team has experimented in times where we have somebody forego using one of these weapons and just bring stratagems, that's what we end up finding out, is if you end up in a scenario where you can't rely on those stratagems, whether because they're jammed or because they're just all on cooldown, you end up really wishing you had one of these. So it has become clear to me that it is intended for you to have these on your team. But which one ultimately is going to be determined by not just personal preference, but overall composition on your team, because that is something you should factor in when you look at what you're going to bring. Because I can bring a grenade launcher if a teammate of mine is bringing an autocannon, but we're still going to need somebody bringing something with a good target damage, whether it's the laser cannon or the railgun is kind of up to them. That's the nice part of having the wiggle room available that they do put into the game. Because if we run into something like a Hulk, the autocannon can deal with them, but not as well as something like the laser cannon or the railgun or anything in between for that matter, because of the armor penetration necessary. Now, if it's just one, then we don't really need to worry about it. If we're at a low difficulty, we're just going to see one, maybe two at a time, then it's not that big a deal. But if we're at a higher difficulty where we could see 4, 5, 6 Hulks at a time, we need somebody bringing something like a laser cannon or a railgun that can take them out very quickly. So keep these things in mind whenever you and your team are trying to pick what stratagems you use. And to try and be fair, I do think there is kind of a problem with how weapons are portrayed and how that comes across to the community versus how the developers intended for them to be used. I think there's a couple of examples of that. Ironically, I think the laser weapons are probably the best example because you've got weapons like the laser cannon, which they had to change around a bit recently. And I think the problem was not that players didn't know what it was for, but more so that the design of the laser cannon overall gave players the wrong impression for what it's for. And that has to do with the fact that it is a laser cannon. First of all, they called it a cannon and made it a shoulder-mounted weapon, which for a lot of players, myself included, I can understand how that's going to make people think that it's an anti-armor weapon because you fire it the same way you do the anti-armor weapons. So if they wanted it to be used like a machine gun, the design should have lent itself more to something like a machine gun, where it was a weapon that was handled and held like a machine gun, but they didn't do that. And because of that, it caused confusion with how the weapon was supposed to be used. But now we've gotten a little clarification from the developers themselves that it's more meant to be a laser-based machine gun alternative than a solid anti-armor weapon. So I wouldn't be surprised if eventually you see the changes they made kind of get rolled back as different options become available. But it also shows in things like the new laser rifle, the sickle, because they call it a burst fire weapon, but it's not a burst fire weapon, it's a fully automatic weapon. But they call it a burst fire weapon because they intend for you to use it in short bursts to prevent overheating. And I think this represents a fundamental disconnect between the design and the communication of the design to the players. I'm not really sure where that's going wrong as far as from an internal standpoint, but I certainly hope that they can get that figured out. I do know that they have voiced that they're looking for a concept artist with weapons experience and that sort of knowledge and military background. I'll be honest, it does sound more like they just want to find a subject matter expert to sort of help them make these things come across more clearly in a way that can be a bit more intuitive. I think the laser cannon is an indication that that's the help they need the most, is more of a military subject matter expert than a concept artist necessarily. But that's not going to stop me from trying to brush up on my artistic skills, even though they've been collecting dust for a while, to see if maybe I can get my concept art skills to the point where maybe I could land a job like that. But it does seem more like they just need somebody with the knowledge to help them get designs to function in a way where things come across a bit more clearly. And again, I just think the laser cannon is sort of a really good indicator that there's a fundamental disconnect between how some of the designs are intended to be used versus how the actual aesthetic of the design itself gives players the wrong impression as a result. So hopefully they can figure that out in the future, because that, I think, is, albeit a smaller part of the problem, I do think that is part of the problem with trying to nail down exactly how these weapons are intended. versus how they come out. But there's also something to be said for the change in progression. I know a lot of people are used to a vertical power progression system and not a horizontal one. So that's also going to take some adjustment, as I know that there's a lot of players coming from games that just aren't used to that kind of thing being the case. But that pretty much wraps this video up. I mostly just wanted to get my overall philosophy across, and I just got off on a little tangent there at the end. But as we go on, I'm going to dig more into stratagems. I'm going to break each of the types down into their own video. This is just the first. I think the next video I'm going to do is going to be the sentry stratagems, because I think there's a lot to unpack there as far as what they're good for, which I think is a little more straightforward since, a lot of it is fairly obvious. But I will get more into things like placement and how you want to place them according to what enemy you're fighting, because that does have an effect as far as the importance of getting a good placement to make sure the turret not just has a good vantage point, but also doesn't get taken out by the enemy you're facing. But who you're facing is going to change how that works. So we're going to get into that in another video on its own. We'll have another video down the line regarding eagle stratagems, and then we'll wrap it up with the orbital stratagems. And again, these are not really going to go into super fine detail. It's going to be more a guidebook to help you understand how the current ones work and apply, and be able to set a foundation for how future editions are going to play into that, so that instead of me making a video every time a stratagem comes out, I can hopefully just create a foundation that helps you analyze new stratagems on your own a little better. Now, hopefully in the future that'll be a little easier. It can be a little difficult right now just because there's so much that we don't get told from a statistics standpoint. And at first I liked it that way, but as time has gone on, I've kind of seen how the lack of information just means that the community kind of just starts making up information in an attempt to fill the gap of what we don't know. And I'm starting to fall into the group that thinks that is overall bad for the game. I don't necessarily think we should get access to all 50 stats of the weapons and stuff like that, but we have so little information and we have so many gaps in our knowledge that our attempts to fill them can actually end up being kind of counterproductive. So hopefully in the future, these things will be a little bit more clear about what something is intended for and what it's best on. If you've got any strange tips, if you've got any edge cases where you were able to use a weapon in a way that maybe was not necessarily the clearly intended purpose, go ahead and drop it in the comments. Let us know so we can test these things out and find all those strange little quirks that this game seems to have. Because with that many hidden stats for weapons that we don't get access to, it just means that we now have a lot to figure out as a community as far as what all these strange little edge cases are. So if you like what you see, if I've earned it, give me a like and a subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.